Hi, I'm Patty Smith.
This is Bert Newton.
Hey, this is Karen.
I'm Sam from Interpol.
I'm Carlos from Interpol.
This is Martha Wainwright.
Alex from the Orb.
And you're listening to a Triple R archive on rrr.org.au.
Triple R is where you are at, and it is just gone 10:30. If you thought that Truman Capote was the gold standard for pasty white people going to the Deep South to write a true crime book, think again. Murder in Mississippi is a new book by John Safran which details the murder of Richard Barrett, a white supremacist, and his black killer, Vincent McGee. Welcome into Triple R, John.
Thank you very much. I came to pick up my CD. I'm a passionate subscriber.
Well, you are a subscriber, aren't you?
Yes.
Which is nice. Now, let's start with Richard Barrett. Who was he and how did you meet him?
He was a 65-year-old white supremacist leader in Mississippi. And a few years ago, I went over there to zing him for a TV show called Race Relations. And I spent 2 days with him. I basically inferred that I took a saliva sample from him, took it to a DNA testing facility. Then, when you get your DNA tested, you're not as pure as you think you are. I go back there, I announce in front of his supporters, he has some African DNA. Anyway, he starts legal action, and the ABC never broadcasts the story. And so not a shred of Richard Barrett or Mississippi makes it to the final show. So that's that. Then a year later, he's murdered in his house by a young black guy. And I think, that's weird. So I'd spent 2 days with him. I had 2 days of interviews with him, so I got into his weird little world. And so, and the trial was scheduled to start pretty soon, so I just had to either do it or not do it. So I just jumped on a plane with a dictaphone and a notepad and got lost in the Deep South writing my true crime book.
Did you originally think that it was going to be a true crime book?
Yes. I like the idea of running away on my own, just psychologically, like not having to plan things too much and get a crew together. Everything's just so complicated with that. So and it was pretty exciting. You can be a lot more truthful when you're writing a book than when you're shooting a documentary.
I think we'll sort of get to that. Knowing Richard Barrett and what you knew of him from that 2 days that you spent with him, did it surprise you that he had wound up murdered?
Just sort of slapped across the face. And I guess the other thing that was kind of weird about it is we're darting all over America and all over the world and meeting eccentric people every 2 days. So even though I spent these 2 intense days with him, I didn't think, this is stuff I'm going to have to commit to memory because... And a lot of the time I was spending with him, I was killing time because basically he needed to think that we're shooting a sincere documentary. So we were faking filming a sincere documentary, but by filming a documentary that we never thought we were ever going to use because we just thought we were going to use this, on the second day when I'd pull the prank, that's the 5 minutes we're going to end up using. So it was mad. So then when he was killed, I started having to, sit there and start going into the innards of my mind, trying to remember all these little things about him that may have demonstrated one thing or another about why he was murdered.
And you remembered him pretty distastefully. Was it just around the fact that you weren't able to show that footage that you didn't particularly take a shining to Richard Barrett?
Well, I didn't like him at all, but I'm pretty desensitised to not liking people that I'm filming. So I didn't take it emotionally. I wasn't oh my God, this guy's such a racist or anything. I was I've come here to film this prank. So, that. But he was he was very sleazy and disingenuous. So, for instance, he'd never quite cough up that he was as racist as he was. He'd leave that to his little underlings. So other people would get in trouble. He didn't even have the guts of his to to just declare his hand, which was kind of infuriating for me.
You kind of put that down a little bit to the fact that he was a lawyer,
Yes.
and he was always sort of covering his bases.
Absolutely.
But Barrett had seemed to have a pretty complicated backstory, even within the white supremacist movement. There were those, and you meet a fantastic character, Jim Giles,
Yep.
and he didn't necessarily believe that Richard Barrett was racist, and there were those that believed that he was working for the FBI, and all wrapped up into that, this conflicting idea of who he is tied in as to whether or not he was gay and whether that had some bearing on the murder. Did you go to this story with your own ideas, and were they challenged in writing this book?
I thought when Richard Barrett was killed, the first story that came out straight away, because he was killed by a young black man and he was a white supremacist, it's like, oh, this is some sort of race crime somehow. It's a race crime. How could it not be? Then pretty soon it came out that he did yard work. He was a gardener for Richard Barrett, Vincent McGee, the black guy. And then the story started coming out that he didn't even know that Richard Barrett was a white supremacist. And he may have just killed him because he felt he'd been ripped off, like he went into the house to get paid for gardening and Richard Barrett tried to rip him off, not pay him enough, and then blew up. Then, pretty soon, a third story came out, which was that Richard, he'd been doing yard work for Richard Barrett, then he came in to get paid, and Richard Barrett cornered him and tried to coerce him into having sex with him. And so then the young black guy, Vincent McGee, went into a sort of gay rage, or what's it called, gay panic or whatever, and then stabbed him, 30 times around the head until his head nearly fell off. So then it became really, complicated because, I wanted an easy story where there's goodies and baddies, but then, it's so complicated because it's like, well, if a gay man, even if he's a white supremacist, comes onto you, does that really give you a right? And obviously it doesn't.
There's an interesting part in your book where you talk to, I think it's your agent, who came down on the complete opposite side of you, and you sort of talk about how he moves in perhaps the gay scene or so on. So he immediately had this idea that this guy had killed him because he was gay, and that was reprehensible. And so did you flesh this out with your creative partners and the people that you work with and so on, and just have all of this information going into you and still get more confused?
Yes, I just, one of the most confusing things was, and I really wish I knew what I knew at the end, at the beginning, was you keep on getting slight different versions of the story, and you don't know what to go with. And then the problem is most non-fiction writers, they just pick one and write it. So I'd been reading a lot of true crime books, and I thought, there's this one truth I have to find out. But then to give you a classic example of, you're talking to one person, they'll talk about, Richard Barrett, he pulled up on the day of the crime in his black SUV, and he got out and asked Vincent McGee whether he wanted to do any work. So you go, okay, cool. Then the next person you talk to, it's like, Richard Barrett, he rode up on his bicycle, got off his bicycle, and then asked Vincent McGee whether he wants to work. It's like, what? What do I write in the book now? Is it the goddamn SUV or is it the bicycle? And these were making me so, and that a million times. And then I didn't really think about it until after the book was published and printed. It's like, my thing wasn't that unusual. It's just that other writers go, listen, I'm just going to go with the bicycle. I'm just going to go with the SUV. I'm not going to tear my hair up over it.
Well, I think this is a really key thing with your book. How important for you and how hard was it for you? And you said in the first answer in this interview that you found this an easier process in terms of being truthful to the story. But how hard was it for you to be truthful within a narrative of a book and the timeline of the book? Because I feel when I was reading it that you have definitely tried to be truthful. There are things in there, and I can imagine you on your journey from your hotel to the airport and you wanting to get every sort of thing that you did in there true and correct. How hard was that for you?
Well, I found that often when you're in a tangle writing something, the way you get out of the tangle is to tell the truth. Because, and you go in, when you're a writer, you go in with this expectation. Like, for instance, when at a certain point the death penalty is off on the table. So I was like, creatively, even though this is awful, it's like, God, that's a huge stake. Then the death penalty gets taken off the table, and I'm like, well, what does that mean? And then to make matters worse, it's not taken off the table in this dramatic way, like the district attorney tells me he's not going to sentence him to death, or there's not this big conference. It's like I pick up the paper and I realise 2 days ago the district attorney told some other journalist that it's off the table, and so now I'm reading it 2 days later. And so everything is like sloppy and undramatic, and so I'm like, they're going, does this ruin the book now? I no longer have the stakes that he's going to might be put to death, and but then you start writing and just going, listen, I'm just going to tell the truth, and then suddenly all those truths end up being interesting, and then suddenly it doesn't matter that the death penalty's been taken off the table.
One of the most interesting paragraphs for me in your entire book was when you're talking to the DA, Michael Guest, about this very thing, and you ask him why he took the death penalty off the table, and part of his answer seems to imply that you being there and taking an interest in the case has meant that they wanted to simplify things and perhaps not sensationalise things quite so much. Did you worry that you were actually having an effect on the story of Richard Barrett and Vincent McGee?
No, I wasn't worried at all, because I had this voice in my head of my worst enemy trying to attack the book and attack me. So I wasn't personally like feeling any white guilt that I'm going into this black community or whatever. I was more going, I can imagine my enemy from my old Triple R days. I can imagine my enemy reading this book and saying, well, John, where do you get off going into this like little black community in Mississippi? Who are you? And so that was really doing my head in. So I started like writing the book for my enemy, which really isn't such a good idea. But I blame UK writer Zadie Smith, because on top of everything else that was trying to be this psychological, tear me down, when I went over there, I read this thing where he said, write as if your enemy is reading your book. But I think that's a really bad idea, because like 99% of people reading my book will be like, they've picked it up because they're kind of interested in it, or me or whatever, and they're like, they wish me well in my journey, so why the hell am I writing the book for my one enemy from RMIT?
Often the problem, but also the delight in your work, that you always try to sort of dot every I and cross every T and be truthful to the subjects that you film, even if they're horrible and awful or if they're great. And we've worked together in the past, and I see you kind of agonising about doing a prank, and there's often an easier way to do it, but you always have to make it real. Did that sort of that obviously has been the overarching sort of theme with you writing this book, that it always had to be real?
Yeah, and I guess it's also creatively. There's an energy when something's real that I've never been able to recreate when it's not real, and sometimes when you fudge something, like for a comedy documentary, it's always interesting because you try to overplay things to sort of cover your tracks, and I don't know, something always just feels right, and people can smell a rat unless it's real. So I'm not sure I always want to be hyper truthful because I'm an ethical, but there's that aspect to it, but there is definitely an aspect that it just works out better creatively when it's the truth.
I'm speaking with John Safran, the author of a new book, Murder in Mississippi. We're going to take a track now and come back shortly. You are tuned to Triple R. I am in the studio with John Safran, the author of Murder in Mississippi, the true story of how I met a white supremacist, befriended his black killer and wrote this book. Good morning, John.
Good morning. Do you like that subheading?
I do.
It's like something that would be on Oprah.
I did agonise because I started reading this book when it was in PDF form. I wasn't sure what the subheading was, and I was sort of thinking, how much in the interview can I reveal about what actually happened on that day between Richard Barrett and Vincent McGee? And, the subheading says everything, so I felt that it was open slather. We could talk about anything with this case.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Now, you have just created a series for Radio National where you interview true crime writers and about their sort of process and ethics and experience of investigating and writing true crime. Did you start that series before you'd finished writing your book?
Yeah. There was just a lot of things that were floating about my head about the process of truth in storytelling, and then I just decided that I'd do a show where I talked to all the true crime writers that I read whilst writing this book or before writing this book to try to figure out how to write a book, and then we'd kind of share our experiences. Like so we were like two soldiers back from war. So for instance, got to talk to John Berendt, author of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, about, well, is the opening chapter of your book really the exact truth, or did you kind of fudge it a little to make it dramatic?
And it was in the middle of this process too that revelations have come out about Truman Capote perhaps fudging some of the police records and so on for In Cold Blood, also a book that you read. And in your book you mentioned that you really can't lie anymore because of the internet.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's not fair at all, because you do something, everyone's got a Twitter account, and you just be foolish to try to get away with things these days. Because, for instance, I've just seen it over my TV shows. Like on my last TV show, I do anything, and there's the guy from Wisconsin. I should have chosen another one, Mississippi, having like everyone's chases you down on the net now, and you can't just run away and think things aren't going to catch up to you.
You did run away for 6 months though, which you said you sort of felt creatively you wanted to do that, your own process of researching and so on. You in putting together this Radio National series, you spoke to author Victoria Redstall, who writes about serial killers, and you bring up actually what it's like to get to meet these killers.
Yes.
How did it work for you, your relationship with Vincent McGee? You spoke with him, but you never actually met him, did you?
Yeah, he was locked up in a solitary confinement. He was in lockdown in this prison for the criminally insane because he'd started a riot at the regular prison, so they dragged him out of there and put him there. So I thought, I'm just never, ever going to get to him. But luckily, I'd sent him a letter, and which he'd got before he was dragged into that prison for the criminally insane. And so then one evening, just out of the blue, like my phone buzzes in my pocket, my cell, and I pick it up, and it's Vincent McGee on the other end, murbling. And then for the next several months, I'm the only one on the outside, because everyone's sort of like moved on from the story by the time I kind of get in contact with him, and no one's interested. His family isn't there or whatever. So I spend like months talking to him on the phone and start running errands for him. And then it becomes some weird relationship where, well, what's he getting out of it? And is he ripping me off? Am I exploiting him? Or it was just, and it was complicated. Like, for instance, he made me go and deliver messages to his ex-girlfriends, to give you one example.
You're obviously incredibly conflicted in the book about becoming too friendly and where that line should be, and particularly when he asks you to go and visit his family and his current girlfriend. And, we won't say exactly what happened, but how much of your sort of journey through this was a worry that you were humanising somebody who did actually kill somebody?
Yeah, I guess it's really confusing when you're writing a book, because you want to have like a reader in mind, but it's the same with TV. Like you want to say, well, what generally do my readers think, because I want to kind of defy their expectations. And then when you're writing a true crime book, it's weird. It's like, well, what's the audience thinking? Are they thinking this guy's really evil because he's a killer? So I kind of play against that and show how the world's complicated, because even though you're a killer, you still have human sides. Or is it the opposite? Are all my readers, are they triple R listeners who are like, oh, this black guy got it really exploited in the deep south by these white things? So I should play against that expectation. So I was for some reason I really thought. I thought more of my readers would be the latter. So I actually spent a bit of time trying to show how things were complicated, and that, even though this was the Deep South and he was black and he's in the white thing, it's messy. He's not totally innocent.
And was that why you think that people had moved on in terms of even the press over there? There were very few people there when he was actually... Because he never went to trial, did he? He pled guilty, so you never actually saw a trial. But the press had moved on because it was no longer a race crime, was it?
Well, there was too much of a messy race crime, and there were there's too many other crimes out there in Mississippi, so the black activists had just moved on to simpler ones. But then there's also just that matter of things just fall through the cracks, and it's amazing that this story, because once you get into the intricacies of the story and you get into Richard Barrett's past, to give you an example, like Richard Barrett was chased by the FBI or followed by the FBI from the 1960s until pretty much his death, and then once you die, your FBI files are released, or you can get them. So I got access to his FBI files, and so I get to follow this like pretty incredible story of Richard's life that's been tracked not by Facebook updates, not by selfies he's taken, but by the FBI just sort of watching him for decades and decades and decades. And then the same with Vincent McGee. Conveniently, he had a criminal record, and I got into that, and basically I read any name that was in anyone he'd committed a crime against, and then I just rocked up to their houses and knocked on the door, and I got to find out more and more about Vincent McGee and his incredible, intricate, confusing past. But yeah, it was interesting. But both of their stories were kind of really interesting in that, if there's a record of someone's life, everyone's pretty interesting.
What was it like just fronting up to people's houses, and that includes Vincent's family? What was your relationship like with Vincent's family?
Well, I was with his brother and sister. They liked me, and his mother was quite suspicious, and I could never get to the bottom of that. But one of the first kind of agitating things that happened to me is when I went over there, I wanted it to be a simple story of me and Vincent's family against the system. But his mother, I noticed she was more concerned with her son being presented as gay by my book than, for instance, her son being, at that point, there was still the death penalty on the table. And so she came to life when there was the accusation that her son may have been gay, and do you think Vincent was thinking that too? That's the thing. So a lot of this book is about how Vincent McGee took a pretty bad plea. He's going to be 65 years jail, and he's 22 when he took it. So why would you take such a bad plea? Why wouldn't you just roll the dice and go to court? Because anything could happen in court, and this was like a small conservative county. So you could construct a story in which a conservative jury might be on his side, because it's like, this old gay man made an advance. Like, who wouldn't fight back against that? And then what I go to explore for a lot of this book was what did Vincent McGee think was going to come out into the light if he went to trial? And did he take 65 years rather than go to a trial where it might come into the light that there was gayness floating about in his background?
How much of it, though, too, is looking at a system in America that is broken? Like, I don't know exactly what's been left out of your book, but it strikes me that throughout he has very inadequate, it seems, advice from lawyers and the people that are charged with looking after him. Yep.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the confusing thing in this book, I guess, and with the Vincent McGee case, is everything you say is true, but he also stabbed to death Richard Barrett, and there's a good argument he didn't have to. But yeah, the court system is crazy in America compared to Australia, because every little county, so not just every state, but every little county has their own kind of self-contained legal system and police system and court system, and they're all voted in by the people in the county. So for instance, you could have a little county in America where everyone's an extremist Mormon, for instance, and they'll vote. And so because everyone there is an extremist, they'll vote in Mormons to being the judges, to being the district attorney, to being the police chief, to being everyone. So then what happens if you're like a young, vulnerable person there who wants to sort of like, complain about abuse within the Mormon system? Like, there's no one to report it to. Like, you have to, because everyone there is part of the community. Did that make sense, or did I explain that badly?
No, it does. It also makes sense.
And so the other thing is court case. What a district attorney chooses to prosecute for is informed by he's going to have to get voted in a couple of years' time. So we see how, Tony Abbott or Julia Gillard, they're so influenced by what they do based on opinion polls. So there you've got the legal system where it's the same thing, but it's like it's people's lives. So the district attorney probably started with the death penalty, putting that on the table because he thought that was going to be good for votes. And then when the case died out, then he kind of took it off the table again.
But he also sort of admits that the death penalty, what comes with that is extra scrutiny, as it should be.
Yeah.
So do you think, did you come away from it thinking that there were pretty glaring holes in this case and an injustice has been done?
Sort of... Yes and no. There's probably other cases where it'd be more... It kind of does come down to who deserves to go to jail for 65 years, if not someone who kills someone. So yeah... Does that make sense?
Let's look at the ethics then around that. Throughout this book, you pay Vincent McGee.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that?
I didn't really think it was that. I didn't personally mind, and I did think about how it was going to look in the book. But then again, you kind of it's this impossible situation where you're going to be attacked both ways because you're either how can you pay a killer, and then the other side is you ripped off this guy who's in this exploited situation when you have so much power against him. But I didn't pay him that. I mean, I paid him over 6 months. I can't even remember, but it was like, thousands of dollars, but I don't think it was like 5,000. So it was somewhere in between 1 and 3,000. And it was in these things called Walmart Green Dot cards where... you go into Walmart and you pay with cash, and then you get this card that's got a number on it, and then when I rang him, that number somehow worked as currency in prison. But I assumed, without thinking too hard, that he was using it for things to increase his comfort in prison. I didn't think it was like going off.
Which possibly included the phone that he made.
Yes,
phone
exactly,
calls
the phone. So that's how he kind of pitched it to me. He'd always pitch it to me that he needed the money, or else we couldn't make the phone calls because he needed the money. And so, I don't know. I just thought as long as I declared it in the book that I still don't really have a problem with it for some reason, because why? Why not?
Somebody that you interviewed for your RN series, and I can't remember who, said that they didn't seem to think that it was a problem if it was a sort of a career criminal, if it was somebody that would just happily profit, whereas if you went to a killer who, so I think it was, maybe it might have been Victoria Redstall who sort of specifically looks at serial killers. But that sort of compartmentalising of how things are right and wrong, did you find that you just had to do that throughout this entire process?
Yeah, I always think that what I'm doing at a particular point with a particular piece of work is never like this comprehensive, holistic thing where it's ticking every box and explaining everything. It's more like I'm one little loop on a big tapestry or whatever. And so if I look at myself that way, I think, well, it probably is good that there's this outsider who's a non-Mississippian going in there, talking to a guy locked in prison, getting his stories, and then telling the stories in a book, and in some sort of loose, unmicromanaged way that kind of contributes something about our knowledge about other people, I guess, is how I'd sort of explain it. And so, does that answer your question? I'm not trying to weasel out of it.
Now that the book is out, I presume you'll send a copy to Vincent?
Yes. I'm sending a copy. I've already started sending them to everyone in the book. Who's in the book, I'm sending them a copy. So
your relationship with everyone in the book, and there are people that you meet sort of multiple times. I do love how we take that process with you, where it was incredibly hard for you to penetrate people's armour and get the story to the end where the cops are just basically giving you free rein to have a look at all the evidence and so on. Did they sort of start to treat you as if you were kind of part of the furniture in Mississippi?
No, not at all. You can't be part of the furniture in Mississippi unless your great-great-grandparents were Mississippians. And Richard Barrett, even though he was a white supremacist there for whatever, 40 years, because he came in his early 20s and he was a New Yorker beforehand, he was never accepted as a local.
And that's why there was suspicion about him working for the FBI with a lot of people. Jim Giles is an extraordinary character in your book, and it did strike me that...
He's a white supremacist.
The white supremacist. You continually kind of hook up with these people who are the Mississippi versions of John Safran. There's Jim Giles, who will only speak to you as part of his radio show,
Yep.
kind of pranking you, and there's Ernest McBride, a black journalist who goes and does a prank at a Civil War recreation. And throughout that, are there just people in Mississippi that are just like you?
Well, I didn't look at it that way. That's a good observation. I looked at them, and I didn't realise at the time, but I did think, I'm kind of hanging out with a lot of like lonely men who just sort of like, because Jim Giles lives alone in a caravan on his mother's farm. He's the white supremacist. Ernest McBride, the black journalist, he lives alone, sort of wandering here and there, and they're the people I kind of hooked up with and felt this sort of, some sort of weird, strange connection to it. So yeah, you do sort of, I guess you go over there and you end up kind of just hanging out with yourself. So I defeated the purpose, didn't I, of trying
to get away.
Yeah,
I think it's a fantastic read. It is called Murder in Mississippi: The True Story of How I Met a White Supremacist, Befriended His Black Killer, and Wrote This Book.
Hey, I'm doing a thing at the Wheeler Centre.
That's right, I was supposed to look that up.
No, that's okay. No, I was just mentioning...
You keep talking about that.
No, I'm doing at the Wheeler Centre next month. Or it's actually presented by the Wheeler Centre. It's at the Athenaeum, and I'm going to be showing, for instance, all the footage of Richard Barrett that was never allowed to be aired on the ABC.
How are you able to show that now?
Well, it was always a bit sort of like what's the word? Hit and miss as to what, like, we probably could have shown. It was always, Richard Barrett was like a very litigious lawyer, and so that played heavily into the decision.
So perhaps if he wasn't a lawyer, you would have been able to play it, even though there was some question about whether this was...
Well, he was very smart. He figured out a way to prosecute a criminal case as opposed to a civil case. So rather than saying, we defamed him, for instance, he said, you trespassed by misrepresentation, and that's criminal charges, and so the ABC just freaked out. But now he's no longer with us. So
you're going to be playing some of that footage, and also because did you film everything, or you at least recorded most of the interviews that you did?
Yeah, I recorded all the phone interviews on dictaphones. I'll be playing some of those in my insane conversations with Vincent McGee. And yeah, just a bit of footage there.
Do you envision that you will keep in touch with Vincent McGee?
Well, it's pretty... even when I was over there, it was pretty labour intensive to keep in contact with him because his phone would always change. And that's when I had an American cell, so I imagine it gets mega complicated.
Does that comfort you?
I've had 2 contacts with him via Facebook. I don't know how you get on Facebook if you're in prison, but he did. And I'm in communication with his brother. So,
what do you think he'll make of the book?
I reckon he'll like it because just in a way that it's good to know that people outside are kind of thinking of you or something. And also, this is all guesswork, by the way. But the other thing is, he's somebody. A book was written about him. An interesting thing I found about both Richard Barrett and Vincent McGee is that they sort of both wanted to be someone, but what were they? And it was almost through the will of wanting to be someone. So it was a bit like the Kardashians, where you kind of go, well, what actually do you do? And like Richard Barrett, just through the will of wanting to be a prominent figure, but like, why? He sort of ended up becoming one.
Do you say why? Because because it was so confusing as to who he was. You talk about these relationships.
I say why because he created this like fictional reality. When I went over there for race relations, we noticed that he tricked all the white people into turning up to his event. So they just thought they were at some mainstream patriotic event, and But everyone looking on would go, oh my God, he's got all these supporters. And I talked to his supporters. His supporters had no idea he was this white supremacist. They just thought they were turning up to this patriotic sports event. So he'd kind of tricked them. Then I looked in the old FBI files from decades earlier, and all the FBI agents made the same observations. They're like, oh, we've turned up to this event, and everyone's confused as to why they're here because they didn't know he was a white supremacist. So he was like this huge phony who created this sort of like phony reality. But then at the end of his life, he gets a book written about him.
Well, we have been speaking with John Safran. Murder in Mississippi is the book, and you will be appearing at the Athenaeum Theatre at 7:30. That's Wednesday the 6th of November, and you can head to thewheelercentre.com for ticket information about all of that. It would be great to see your pasty face up on stage and reading through the book. It's up live on stage and even bigger on the big screen as you see the band footage. Congratulations on the book, John.
Thank you very much.
It's a fantastic read. Murder in Mississippi. We have been speaking with John Safran. You are listening to Triple R. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Triple R.
For complete access to the Triple R archives, which include over 100 interviews, live-to-air performances, documentaries and other Triple R specials, become a subscriber via the link on our website. Thanks for listening to Triple R.